The story begins at the Breyer residence, a huge family house in a quiet area. Inside the house, we see a couple struggling to make a baby. Just when they're getting in the mood, the woman named Tori suddenly senses something. Her husband Kyle asks what she felt, but she tells him that whatever she was feeling must have stopped. However, just then, there's a loud crash outside the house and the lights go out. They look outside the window and see a strange red light glowing from afar, and they're both perplexed by the sight. The scene changes, and next, we see a series of home videos of a baby growing up, and this baby happens to be Tori and Kyle's child. 10 years later, the family is still living there, and we see Tori looking all over the house for the 10-year-old old son, Brandon. When she doesn't find him in the house, she goes over to the old barn where Brandon jump scares her. After getting over the instant shock, Tori tells him that he's getting too old for games like that. The two meet up with Kyle, who is doing some work outside. He reminds Brandon that he shouldn't be playing in the barn because it's dangerous, pointing out that it has rusty nails and other sharp objects. At school, we see Brandon busy drawing some strange symbols while the teacher shows the class a close-up video of bees. The teacher asks if anyone can state the differences between wasps and bees. None of the students knows the answer except Brandon. He goes on to give a very detailed answer which impresses the teacher. However, the other students quickly get jealous and make fun of him for knowing so much about insects. They all laugh at some rather dry jokes about Brandon, except one of the girls in the class, who instead encourages him. At home later that night, Tori goes to check up on Brandon, and after confirming that he's asleep, she goes downstairs and begins to paint. Meanwhile, elsewhere, something quite strange is happening. Behind a chained wooden door, a bright red light begins to glow and an ominous voice can be heard. Inside the house, the lights begin to flicker and the music from the radio gets distorted. Tori gets the sense that something weird is going on but chooses to ignore it and just turns off the music to continue her painting. Meanwhile, Brandon, who's sleeping in bed, seems to suddenly get possessed by something. Following the ominous voice, he walks to the window and jumps down from it. Downstairs, Tori hears the noise and is now certain that something strange is happening. She slowly goes outside, suspecting that Brandon might have snuck out to the barn again. When she goes to the creepy barn, she finds him mindlessly trying to open the wooden trapdoor on the floor. She touches him, and he regains his consciousness. He's confused, so she just tells him that he was sleepwalking, and at this point, it seems like Tori knows something about what's behind the door. She takes him back to the house and pets him till he falls asleep. Not long after, Kyle returns home and asks if everything is okay. Tori just tells him that Brandon was outside, leaving out the fact that he went to the barn. The next morning, Kyle and Brandon fix a door together. He tells Brandon how he would give him candy to calm him down when they first adopted him as a baby. So Brandon asks if it worked, and Kyle concludes that it did, seeing that he turned out pretty okay. A while later, Brandon tries to use the lawnmower, but it doesn't start, so he gets frustrated and does something very shocking. In his rage, he flings the heavy machine over the fence and sends it flying several meters away. The blades are finally spinning, and out of curiosity, he puts his hand there, but instead of getting his fingers chopped off, the blades are destroyed. Sometime after that, Brandon celebrates his birthday, and Tori's sister Marilee joins the family with her husband Noah. After dessert, Noah gives Brandon a present, and strangely, it's a gun. Kyle doesn't approve and confiscates the gift, but Brandon demands that he give it back. The parents are surprised by his sudden misbehavior, so they leave the diner and take Brandon home. At home, Tori and Kyle are concerned about what happened with Brandon at the diner and begin to reminisce about their childhood. Eventually, they conclude that a camping trip would be good for him. The next day, Kyle is shocked to see that Brandon chewed a fork. It gets even worse when Tori finds pictures of adult models and human internal organs, which gets them very concerned. When they get to the campsite, Kyle decides to talk with Brandon during a little hunting expedition. That night, Tori wakes up and finds out that Brandon is missing. Meanwhile, the kind girl from Brandon's class is haunted in her home. It turns out that she's Brandon's crush. She yells for help, and her mother comes to check on her. She tells her that she saw someone by her window, and after her mother investigates, she doesn't find anyone there. She asks her daughter who she saw, and she tells her that it's Brandon Breyer. Back in the woods, Tori and Kyle are looking all over the place for their son. Suddenly, Brandon reappears and also manages to jump scare his mother like usual. After the trip, the family returns home and Tori shares her concerns about Brandon to Marilee, who's working as the guidance counselor at his school, and she assures Tori that there's nothing to worry about. Tori then looks over Brandon's shoulder and sees him drawing the strange symbols again, which he hides from her when he sees her coming. At home, Brandon begins to use his new powers to torment the chickens with his mind. Kyle sees him in the barn and sends him to his room, but later, he comes back down to find all the chickens dead. Kyle claims Brandon is responsible, but Tori insists that it's a wolf. Things get worse from here because Brandon gets into more trouble at school. He breaks the hand of his crush after she calls him a pervert for looking through her window. His parents are invited, and the girl's mother, Caitlin, gives everyone a piece of her mind. Tori and Kyle apologize and take their son home. At home, they have a serious discussion about their son, reflecting on his childhood, and realize that he's never been injured or bled like most kids do in their childhood due to accidents. Later that night, Brandon hears the voices again and gets drawn back to the barn. This time, he manages to break the locks on the door. From inside the house, Tori sees the bright red light glowing even more, so she goes there and finds Brandon levitating and repeating something she can't understand. She touches him and he falls to the ground, injuring himself for the first time. He comes back to his senses and asks where he is, so Tori comforts him and tells him the truth about where he came from. It turns out that he came from space, and the thing behind the door was the vessel he crash-landed in as a baby. Brandon is furious at his parents after hearing the story and begins destroying things all over the house. He storms out of the house saying, "Take the world," over and over again. Next, Brandon visits his injured crush, who is now terrified of him. He has a short conversation with her before disappearing again. Later, at the diner, the waitress sees the same strange symbols Brandon draws all the time scribbled all over the window. She's terrified because the lights are flickering. It gets worse for her when one of the bulbs scatters and a piece of glass enters her eye. She tries to escape, but Brandon, who's now wearing a mask, catches and attacks her. The next morning, Tori and Kyle notice that Brandon seems a lot calmer than the previous night, but they're still quite afraid of him. The sheriff investigates the incident at the diner and sees the strange symbols. He also finds out that the waitress is still alive. Meanwhile, Brandon begins his counseling sessions with Marilee, and he tells her how he believes he's special superior to other humans. Later that night, Brandon haunts Marilee in her house and then knocks on the door. He tells her not to tell the sheriff anything about him if she's asked, but she tells him that she has to do her job, so he leaves. She goes to bed, and her husband Noah returns shortly after, but is shocked to find Brandon wearing a mask and hiding in the closet. He gets upset and takes him outside, but Brandon tells him not to inform his parents. When Noah tries to force Brandon into the car, Brandon's eyes turn bright red again, and he throws him away. Terrified, Noah drives away, but Brandon uses his powers to tumble the car, causing Noah to get severely injured and disfiguring his face. Brandon then uses Noah's blood to draw the strange symbols on the ground before disappearing. Meanwhile, Kyle has a nightmare of the night they found Brandon, and he sees Tori bleeding from her eyes and mouth in the dream. Soon, Tori and Kyle find out about Noah's accident, so they rush to go see Marilee at the hospital, and she informs them that Brandon came over to her house the previous night. The following day, Tori and Kyle inform Brandon that Noah is dead, but he doesn't show any sympathy. He tells them that he would never hurt Noah, but Kyle gets upset and scolds him. Brandon retaliates and pushes his father into the cabinet, breaking most of the plates. Afterward, Kyle goes up to search Brandon's room. He finds a bloody shirt and accuses Brandon of killing Noah, but Tori refuses to believe it. She says that their son would never kill anyone, but Kyle angrily tells her that Brandon isn't their son. That night, Kyle tells Tori that he's going to take Brandon on a camping trip the following day. But we all know where this is going. After the father and son set off in the morning, Tori stays back to work on her painting. The sheriff visits her to ask about the symbols, but she denies knowing anything about it. After he leaves, she goes to Brandon's room and finds his drawing book, where she sees horrifying pictures that prove he was responsible for all the things he's been accused of. Meanwhile, out in the woods, Kyle tries to kill Brandon by shooting him in the head. Physically, he's unscathed, but emotionally, he feels very hurt, so in his rage, he kills Kyle by blasting his eyes and face with powerful fire beams from his eyes. At home, Tori, who now knows the truth, is terrified and tries to call Kyle, but Brandon answers the phone and tells her that Kyle is dead. Shortly after, he returns home to haunt the house with Tori inside. She calls the police, but Brandon brutally murders them, so she runs to the spaceship, remembering that it was the only place where Brandon ever got hurt. He follows her there, but she pretends not to be afraid of him. She tells him she loves and hugs him while trying to stab him, but he stops her. Enraged, he grabs her and flies her up in the air before dropping her from there. He watches her fall to her death and sees some lights flying toward him. The scene shifts, and the next thing we see is a news report of a plane crashing into the Breyer house the following morning. The crash allegedly killed everyone there, but it just so happens that there is one survivor. The story ends with Brandon smugly eating a cookie, knowing that he got away with everything. That's all for today's recap. Hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe, and hit the notification bell to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.